Hello, I'm Ivan Mulcahy, literary agent, and I'm going to spend a few minutes now interviewing Scott James, a new first time author of a crime thriller called Hostile Witness. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Ivan. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. So, your book is a pacey, classic police procedural uh, crime thriller. And you yourself are a senior ex-Metropolitan Police officer, and you've served all of your career there. Um, Tell me, were you sitting waiting to write this book for many years?
Well, I've been a voracious reader. I've read all of my life. I love reading. I can't actually remember a time when I didn't have a book in my hand. And for me, I was very, very keen to write, but I was also very proud to be in the Metropolitan Police. And for me, there's no better calling than that of public service. And I gave 100% to that career. And I couldn't really do both. So for me, now's come the time to be able to dedicate my time to writing. And the book's been planned for probably 10 to 12 years, and I've started it and written it and rewritten it probably about 7 or 8 times to get to the point that we are today. So for me, it's been a lifelong dream, and I love crime fiction. I love all types of fiction, but I do like crime fiction.
Yeah, we usually don't tell new authors how many drafts it takes to produce a good book, because I don't think people would start out if they realized how long the process is to really learn your craft. It's one of a series, though. You're planning more of these, yeah?
Definitely. So I think so. The main protagonist, Detective Inspector Jack Barnes, he's got lots of adventures ahead of him, and definitely one of a series.
Tell me, what made you decide to set it in Camden?
So I set it in Camden, in North London, in 1996, and Camden at that time was just an intoxicating mix of local gangsters and Britpop musicians and undercover cops, all drinking in the same pubs. And interestingly, everyone kind of knew the rules, and there were these sort of unwritten rules that everyone adhered to. But it was such a fantastic time, and you had the backdrop of Euro '96, the football championships that were going on as well. So London, and in particular Camden at that time, was absolutely buzzing. So for me, it seemed natural to set it at that time because it was just such a great time to be there.
So this is kind of the center of like the Britpop era and so on. I mean, you a fan of that kind of music? That kind of that stuff appeal to you?
Very much so. So I lived for 3 years in Manchester, and I think that city got into my genes. And yeah, I love Oasis and the Stone Roses and those sorts of bands. And
So
obviously,
sorry, but you're telling me you're hanging around in plain clothes at music gigs, simultaneously on duty, getting paid, and also loving the sound?
well, no, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, Ivan, but it was a great time because, of course, you saw these people in the different pubs, whether it was somewhere like the Good Mixer or the Dublin Castle in Parkway in Camden. So you saw a lot of artists around, and it was just a fantastic time to be there.
Yeah, very good. Um, Jack Barnes, your main character, it doesn't work on his own. He has a team around him, and they're working on cold cases. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, so Jack, that sort of intoxicating mix and vibe I spoke about of London at that time. Jack's not really feeling that, so he's living in his car. He's recently divorced, and he's really down on his luck. His career's stalled, but he gets thrown a lifeline in the form of running a cold case rape investigation team using new DNA technology. And he's got a small team that are assembled. So Pam Mills, who's a detective sergeant, and a young forensic scientist called Lizzie Granger. So the three of them then hunt down sexual predators from a previous era, and that's the premise. That's the sort of setting of the book.
I thought that was one of the distinctive and indeed appealing things about it when I first read it, because you're a police officer. You're on the blunt end of trying to prevent crime and catch criminals and so on, running towards the trouble rather than away from the trouble, as people sometimes say. But yet I know that we are all concerned about attitudes in society towards rape and sexual offences. I think we all feel that too much pressure is put on the victims, that the trauma of actually being part of a prosecution can be almost as bad, indeed not worse, than the trauma of the original event. So I was heartened to see a senior police officer look at the subject of sexual offences and fold it into a theme of a classic crime thriller. Is that something that you thought about, or is that something that just came about as you were writing?
No, it definitely is something I've thought about a lot. So I think for me, with crime genre, actually, it's quite interesting because it nearly always focuses on murder, and it doesn't focus on rape and sexual offences. And for me, I think those offences are so serious. I'm not saying that murder isn't, obviously, but they are serious offences, and the victim has to live with the consequences of those offences for the rest of his or her life, equally as do their partners and families. But also, I think for rape, and what's so interesting with society's attitude towards rape victims, is that people are almost judged on how they respond to being a victim. So whether that's in the witness box, and they're giving evidence, and if they're not bursting into tears, visibly upset, then there's a judgment made by society as a whole. So I don't mean just the police, I mean, the society as a whole. And I think the police have come a long way in how we support victims of sexual offences and crime. And I wanted to get that across because so often it's badly portrayed. And certainly in my experiences with the men and women that I've worked in various different sexual offences team across London, they've given 110% to those investigations. And that, for those reasons, I wanted to talk about it and get that out in the novel.
Yeah, I got you, because obviously the vast majority of the victims of sexual crime are women, and the portrayal of what women go through in the reporting of it and subsequently is just it's very unsettling. And of course, it's good to hear that things have got better since, a great deal better in terms of at the level of just simply dealing with the person who's traumatized after the event. But that doesn't help them on their day in the courtroom, the outlook of the jury, the outlook of obviously the prosecution and defense barristers, the outlook of the judge, and indeed the general public who are, reading these reports of these prosecutions in a prurient kind of way. So I'm hoping what you've done here would make a little contribution towards starting most of the readers of your book to think about these things in a more empathetic way towards the victim. But let me turn to the era. It's the 90s, and I think there's a particular reason too, aside from Britpop and aside from that being the Camden of your young era as a police officer, that you chose the 90s. And that's around DNA, isn't it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's right. So DNA technology came into being a few years before, but it wasn't used properly and mainstream really until the mid-90s, until 95, 96, when the National DNA Database was founded. And for me, it was almost a watershed, I think, around particularly sexual offences, actually, around the use of DNA and how, like fingerprints at the turn of the previous century, how you were able to say that, that particular person was present. And for sexual offences, obviously, that was very prevalent because what it meant was that you were able to say that the offence had taken place or that the sexual act had taken place, but it then came down to a consent issue, and that's where there's almost more pressure as a consequence, because how the victim responded, of course, is then judged and very important when it comes down to consent. So for me, I think DNA was a fundamental change really in policing during that time. So you had
sorry, but you could almost say that there's police work or police investigation pre-DNA and post-DNA in terms of the way that investigations work. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so, because you were able to use, be a lot more scientific, obviously, in how. So for all investigations for murder, for
Sure.
sexual offences, you were able to find more traces of the suspects there. You were able to eliminate people as well as a consequence. So it worked both sides of justice, actually, because people were able to say, well, actually, I wasn't there, and then their DNA might have been somewhere else at that time. So
and yet, sorry to Scott, but I'm just really struck by, as you point out, all of this help with DNA technology ensures that in many cases it can be proved that the sexual act took place, that both participants were there together and the act took place, but almost that puts more pressure on the victim of a rape, because it becomes more about proving that it wasn't consensual. So it's almost more emotionally and physically intrusive for that person to argue about exactly the nature of the event rather than simply whether it took place or not.
Yeah, that's right. It can be, because then it comes down to other factors. So was there a scene of violence in a room, or was there bruising on the victim? How the victim responded? All of those things, and as a consequence, a lot of pressure can come down to the victim for he or she to have to explain that it wasn't consensual and that this offence had taken place. And there's a lot of pressure then on those individuals to then almost to behave in a certain way, and that was
Right.
what I wanted to get across in the novel.
Right.
That it is really hard for people because they're judged by society.
Well, listen, you've highlighted that event well, but you've also done what you need to do to find a big base of readers, which is you've folded it into an absolutely cracking and fast-paced crime thriller. So which is an engaging story that I'm sure readers will read in droves. Scott, let me ask you about one other thing. Early on, your main protagonist Jack takes a swim in the Serpentine at kind of 6 o'clock in the morning. But there's also a description too of kind of walking around in that kind of London in the early dawn. I've lived in London a long time. And there's several other moments in the book where you kind of convey a very strong sense of place. Did you see London as a character?
Very much so. So for me, London is ever evolving, and it was very much a character, and it's very much a character in the book. So there's nothing better than being in the middle of the city first thing in the morning in that pre-dawn light, getting into the water and swimming. It's something I've done for a long time, and it's just magical. But then also, traveling to different parts of London on different investigations that I've done over the years, and you see the different architecture. So the sort of tighter Victorian streets in North London, off the Holloway Road and Kentish Town and Camden. And then you go south of the river and you see the big, wider streets, but the taller buildings, which are, remnants of London being rebuilt in the war. So for me, London's very much, it's so vibrant, and it's very much a character in the novel, which I wanted to come out.
Yeah, and I think it does very well. Congratulations for that, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you.